Welcome to the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. We're going to explore ways to sharpen our diagnostic skills, find learning resources, and hear from experts in the automotive field. This show is brought to you by Automotive Seminars. If you're looking to stay up on the cutting edge diagnostic strategies and techniques, this is the place. You've got live 4-hour seminars that are put online that you can join in, ask questions, interact with the instructors with some of the best of the best. They've got Keith Perkins and John Thornton putting on classes like network diagnostics, mechanical engine testing, advanced electrical testing, and GDI diagnostics, and a ton more. And once you purchase one of these training seminars, you can access this at any time that you want through your account at automotiveseminars.com. You can rewatch the training a year, 2 years later, which makes this training even more valuable. So I highly recommend you check this out. The link is in the show notes. Hey, what's going on, automotive world? Welcome to another episode of the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. My name is Sean Tipping, and I'll be your host once again this week on the show. Tomi Oliva joins me as a host, and we have the one and only John Thornton joining us as a guest today. John is one of the all-time greats in our world. He's been delivering top-level diagnostic and drivability training for many years. Many of you listeners have had the opportunity of taking one or more of his classes over the years, whether it be in person or online. We'll talk about both. If you haven't, hopefully this conversation encourages you to do so. But we're going to talk about some of John's beginnings when he was just getting started in the automotive world and teaching. What goes into developing a class, what's his process for documenting out in the field, turning it into a class, the types of things that he chooses to turn into a class, and a whole bunch more. This was an excellent talk and a really cool opportunity. I've gotten to talk to a lot of really impressive people and meet a lot of impressive people through the podcast in the automotive world, but this definitely ranks up there as one of the top. I definitely appreciate the time John spent with us. I know you're going to enjoy it as well. We got 2 hours with him, so get ready. Let's jump in. All set. All right. Good afternoon, gentlemen. I am excited. How are we doing today?
I am doing well. I am doing well. Looking forward to this. This is my my second podcast.
Yeah, I heard the one with you and Matt.
Yeah, that was the first ever, and now this is the second. So they both came by pretty quick. That was enjoyable. It was a good time. But I find it's easier certainly to be on the listening end than the talking end. But yeah.
I get a lot of that from people like, "Are you nervous before a podcast?" I'm like, it's just, for me, it's a conversation, honestly. I thought actually, 2 weeks ago, I presented in Nashville for the first time in front of like a crowd. It was about 200 plus people, and I wasn't even nervous. It was actually a pretty fun experience, my first big crowd. So I'm actually excited to do another one. So I don't know, but a lot of people do seem to have I just don't know what to talk about, nervousness when it comes to podcasts.
Well, a podcast, to use your example, a podcast is a little bit different than a training event. When you do a training class, you have a plan, you have a PowerPoint, you've rehearsed, you know what you're going to talk about. The only surprise, might be a question or two that you haven't anticipated. So
yes.
you know exactly what's going to happen. I think with a podcast, again, from a listener's viewpoint, that's where my experience is. It can go in a lot of directions. And, normally I'm used to podcasts that have two people, so three people, there's always, again, there's a wild card because now you have three people discussing. And I'm sure if there was a fourth, that probably gets busy too. And I've heard that on other shows that I've listened to with four people. it's pretty busy, but yeah, I certainly get nervous in front of a training class, before my mouth opens. But here, I really don't have any. I don't have any jitters. I think I'm good.
Do you still get nervous, like if you're going in front of a big crowd at Vision or something like that? You've been doing this for quite some time now. Like you still get those butterflies in your stomach?
Wow, Sean, that was so polite. Quite some time. So yes, it has been quite some time actually. But yes, I was at Vision March of 24. That was the last class I presented there. And the room, it's a double wide room. There's approximately 250, 260 people, in the room. And, before, the clock strikes, before you got to go, you're up there kind of by yourself and you look out and it's kind of an amazing view actually, in that you see all these people and they're there to listen to what you have to say. And I think most presenters will probably say the same thing, in that, there's a lot of pressure to deliver. So yes, to answer your question, I'm nervous. But once I start going, that has to disappear,
Mm-hmm.
and it does disappear. And part of that is because of, rehearsal, practice. But, it is still it's a kind of a wonderful feeling actually, when you are in front of an audience and, there's a lot of people there. So I've always considered the delivery of the training class to be the reward. So you spend hours and hours, putting the class together, getting it organized, you spend a lot of time. And I know you both have trained, so you know what I'm talking about. You spend a lot of time, then finally you're able to present for an hour or two or three, or whatever it may be. I'll tell you, one of the times I was most nervous was at a TST event hosted
Ooh.
by Jerry Triglia out in New York, and I had just had shoulder surgery. So
Mm.
I was in a sling, and when Jerry hosts TST, everybody listens to you, so the room is packed. And that room, I think, I could be exaggerating unintentionally, but I think it was 450 people
Yeah.
Oh
in this
man.
room. I mean, and we're on a small platform, 3-4 feet off the ground. And when I looked out, I had never seen anything quite like that. It was literally, a sea of people. And normally, in a class, even at Vision, with a couple hundred, it's not that hard to make eye contact. You can, look to the back of the room, look to the left, look to the right. But
Yeah.
there, I couldn't even see the back of the room. So
Jeez.
it was so far away. Now Jerry, he had monitors for everybody, so everybody there could see. But it was, that made me a little nervous because, again, my shoulder was in a sling. I had this group that I had never spoken to a group that large before. Fortunately, I think from my perspective, it went well. Certainly I was nervous. I was, a little bit of butterflies. But again, once your mouth opens, at least for me, I'm good.
Yeah, I found that too. Is once you get rolling, that first few minutes and you're into the material, then the nerves start to calm down and it becomes easier. But yeah, for the few times that I've done it in front of a larger crowd, yeah, those first few minutes, I'm just trying to get my bearings, trying to get it, heart rate down a little bit and into the material.
Well, I think it's good to be a little bit nervous, a little bit anxious,
Means you
that
care.
forces you, yeah, yeah. I mean, it forces you to kind of get ready and get on your
Mm-hmm.
game because, the clock is about to start and there's,
Yep.
a lot of people there, and
Mm-hmm.
you don't want to disappoint anybody, of course.
That's a big one
Yeah,
for
like you said, all the prep time that goes into it.
Tommy, is Tommy having a video problem or audio?
There
Tommy?
might be just a hair delay there.
Okay. 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 That's fine. Because I know Tommy is heading to Australia for their big training event. And you were there, was it a year ago?
Yep, I was actually about a year to the day. I was down there training. I was just looking at some pictures from that. That was a wild experience. We had such a great time, and so cool to see people on the other side of the planet that are just as passionate, if not more so, about this stuff. It was really really cool.
Oh yeah, that had to be exciting. That had to be
Yeah.
exciting.
yeah,
That's for sure.
could have
So
been us.
are we? You want to go? Go ahead.
No, I said it could have been us, John. Remember they tried getting you to go and you were just like, nope, sorry, Not happening.
Well, yeah, it's a little late for me to go there. There's plenty of places left here in the U.S. So, I've taught probably in most states in the United States, and haven't been to Alaska. And the one state I haven't taught in that I was always disappointed that I didn't was Hawaii. So nobody ever called me to say, "Hey, come on, John, visit Maui for a week and teach a couple of classes." So that never happened. I think the close I got to it, I don't know if you recall this, uh, a few years ago, Sherry Hamilton, she
Hmm?
wanted to have a vision south of the border. That's what she called it, and it was in Cancun.
Oh
So she
yeah.
Okay.
actually, and it was like a vacation. It was, I think people went there. Well, I shouldn't say I think. People went there to take a vacation. And by the way, there's a little bit of training that's going to occur.
Right.
So I remember doing a couple classes, and it was the only time that I'd ever taught that I wore a t-shirt and shorts in order to kind of stay with the atmosphere. And
Uh-huh.
believe it or not, people actually showed up. Not a lot, but some people showed up for the classes. So, but
Yeah, you imagine people showing up hungover for a class at Vision. I gotta imagine down there it might be even worse.
Es-
oh yeah. Well,
Especially.
I think Sherry was smart enough. Yeah, I think they were afternoon classes. So, uh,
Okay, okay.
but yeah, but that was about the only exotic spot that I ever had a chance to teach in. Otherwise, it's been major cities, major areas throughout the United States, and a little bit in Canada as well. But yeah, it's always been interesting at various events.
It looks like Tommy might have dropped out. We'll just keep kind of rolling here, and
Sure,
then if he pops back in, like I said, I can edit stuff, so it'll be all good. But
no
yeah,
problem.
what I thought would be cool for, I mean, myself and the listeners as well is I don't really know your story as far as how you got started in the automotive field. Like, did you start off just as a general technician in an independent shop? Did you work in a dealership? Like, where did you get your beginnings with automotive?
Yeah, it's something I really don't talk about much. Not because I don't want to talk about it, but it's usually when you're in a class, you're in a class, and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
times when you're talking to people at an event, you're talking about specific topics or certain issues with vehicles. But I'll tell you, my very beginnings was probably around age 12, 13, trying to install lawnmower engines on a bicycle to make it a mini
Okay.
bike.
Nice.
So, so that is the humble beginnings, and not really worrying about braking, just worrying about accelerating, kind of,
Yeah, the fun part.
the fun part. So that's really kind of how it started. Was I don't know why, but I had some interest in mini bikes, and I went to a all boys Catholic high school. There was no type of shop training at all. So it was strictly academics and sports. And then I went to a junior college in a suburb of Chicago called Triton College. It's a 2 year
Okay.
program, and it was good. I learned the fundamentals, but there was a class that I took, engine rebuilding, taught by this gentleman who has since passed, named Ray Oviak, and he was the first really positive influence on me to diagnose. Because what was interesting about his class was obviously we were going to rebuild, and we're going to rebuild one of our own personal vehicles' engines. But the first part of the class was on how to diagnose the problem with the engine. So, this was a long time ago. Scan tools weren't around yet, but,
Okay.
talking about, how to do a power balance, how to use a two gas analyzer, how to disable cylinders with a test light, but the idea
Mm-hmm.
was, the whole concept was you should know what's wrong before you tear it down. And I had never been exposed to that. For me, mechanics was, I look at brakes, it needs brakes. The
Mm-hmm.
suspension component is loose, it needs the suspension component. So that class really was kind of a turning point in terms of how I do things today. That was really, I think, the beginning of it. And while I was at Triton, in between my first and second year, you would have the 3 months off during the summer. There
Mm-hmm.
used to be a school in Chicago called American Motorcycle Mechanic School, and it was on the north side of the city. Since too bad we left lost Tommy here, he would know the location if I were to tell him. But
Okay.
it was about a 3-month day long program where you learned how to repair motorcycles. And I forget the gentleman's name who kind of ran it, but his claim to fame was he was Evel Knievel's head mechanic at one point of his
Oh,
career.
no kidding.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
and everybody knew that because he made sure everybody knew that.
Oh,
But
yeah. Yeah.
nonetheless, he was a capable guy. And even though we were working on, motorcycles, a lot of Harleys at that time, he also emphasized diagnostics. Figuring out what was wrong, how to tune before we disassemble and make repairs. At Triton, and that's where I got, a pretty good start in just learning about this concept of trying to diagnose.
Mm-hmm.
And my first, what I would call official job as a repair shop technician, where I was actually in a shop and somebody was giving me money, was a small shop in a suburb of Chicago, owned by two brothers. And they were really great guys. And they hired me while I was still going to Triton. It was my final year there. And, they knew that I wasn't going to bring much to the table. They gave me simple things to do. They nudged me along. They reinforced that if I did something, something was good. They reinforced that. And they had a big box Sun analyzer. So they too
Sure.
suggest, you hook up, and at the very least, you get a secondary ignition pad, and you
Mm-hmm.
go from there. So, I had some pretty good reinforcement there. And then when I got out of Triton, I decided, I'm working in this shop now full time, general repair. And to answer your question, I was never in a dealership, so I've
Okay.
never worked in a dealership. But so while I'm working now, I'm kind of thinking about to myself that, there's a lot to learn here, and I'm really interested in the diagnostic piece. I'm interested in why these parts work the way they do. How's an engineer figure this out? And after being only like 6 months in the field, so I graduated in June, and then I decided by December that, what, I need to further my education. So
Mm-hmm.
I went to a school down in Peoria, Illinois. Peoria is about 2.5 hours south of Chicago, called Bradley University. And at the time, they had an automotive engineering program. So I decided I would take this program to really better expand my knowledge. And fortunately, most of my credits at Triton applied. So I was only there for 2 years. I had to take a couple summer classes, but I was able to get out of there in 2 years. And it was a good school, and I had good instructors. But the highlight of that for me, today, looking back on all those years, was many of those engineering classes. They were really teaching us how to think. How
Mm.
to identify a problem, how to understand what the problem is, and then how to come up with a solution. And a number of the instructors that taught there were part-time, and they worked full-time for Caterpillar. So back in that time period, Caterpillar's headquarters was in Peoria, Illinois.
Okay.
So, and Caterpillar and Bradley University had a pretty strong relationship. So, I was able to get an education from engineers that were doing it. Not to say, the other instructors weren't capable; they certainly were. But it was interesting when the engineers that were designing whatever they were designing would teach. They were able to bring in real world examples. Now, a lot of it, of course, was diesel, and that's fine. But it was, again, they were emphasizing on identify the problem. What is the problem? What are the parameters that you have to deal with, and how do you come to a solution? So, I
Okay.
look back today on all those years ago. If somebody were to say, in 30 seconds, what did you learn at Bradley University? My answer would be, I learned how to think. I learned how to analyze a problem. And it seems simple, but prior to that, I didn't really address issues like that. If a car didn't
Right.
start, I didn't have a routine. I didn't think I should have a routine. I'll just do this test. I'll do that test. It was random. It was
Uh-huh.
random.
Yeah.
So I was really, really lucky that in my education, junior college, and then at Bradley, that I had the right instructors that kind of forced me to look at things maybe a little bit differently than I would have had I not had those experiences. So
Yeah.
that's that part cannot be underestimated. How important it is, to have, no matter what we do, to develop a routine, a guideline, or a plan. And to this day, whether I'm diagnosing an issue on a vehicle or presenting a class, I follow that same format. Obviously, different in the two areas, but the format for me is the same.
Yeah, I mean, for your typical automotive tech school, I mean, obviously there's a lot of different ones out there, but most of them it's not going to go that sort of path for teaching, how to get through a problem, right? It's usually like, okay, here's how the system works. Let's go out to the shop and do a few things with it. But yeah, having the engineering approach, because I mean, that kind of is engineering too, is like, let's design a solution for a problem. Let's fix something by designing this thing. And so, yeah, that's pretty cool. To be able to take that type of course like early on, for sure.
And at the time, I didn't realize how important that would be to me. Looking back, I would recommend that to anybody. Not to say that you have to have to get an engineering degree. I think college in general, if you're fortunate enough to have the right instructors, regardless of the discipline, you should learn how to address issues, how to address a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And one other area where I got a little bit lucky in as well is that when I came back to Chicago from Bradley, I realized that my mechanical understanding was pretty good. Bradley was a good school. We talked about a lot of automotive engineering concepts, but my electrical background was at best fair. It was not particularly good. I was able to use a test light, but I'm not sure I could really explain a lot of electrical concepts. So I went back to Triton to take their electronics program. And
Okay.
again, it was easy to do because I already had an associate's degree. So all I really worried about was I did this at night part-time, took a little while, but I just took electronics class 2 nights a week.
Okay.
And now this again is a long time ago, and the focus was on DC electronics and AC electronics. And I would recommend this to any automotive technician, is that type of formal non-automotive electrical training can be really, really beneficial. That's when I first learned how to use an oscilloscope. It was an analog scope. It wasn't digital. It was analog. But as we were taking these classes, part of the class was you're using a multimeter. Everything was done on a bench. We weren't doing anything on a vehicle or anything like that. It was again non-automotive, but it was all bench work. So we learned how to use a voltmeter. They had circuits that we would build, that we would measure voltages. And you learn the concept of voltage drop, current flow, which back then that was kind of new to me. I had heard it before, but I really didn't understand it. And then when we got to AC electronics, now you learn the concepts of capacitors and inductors and the difference between, for example, resistance and impedance. So now you start to learn these concepts, and then they broke out the scope. And I thought to myself, my gosh, I should have written that day down in my diary if I had a diary. But that was a significant life-changing event for me when it came to diagnosing, because a scope, oh my gosh, this thing is too cool. And I'll just share with you something kind of funny. So I'm taking this class. I'm in my early 20s, and I have a good friend of mine who at the time was working at a printing facility in Chicago. They had large printing presses, and their claim to fame back then was they printed Playboy magazine. They used to do that here in Chicago. Anyway, so he was an electrician, and they used to use a scope to do some type of calibration on a press. I had no idea what this was, but he said, John, he heard me talk about this. He goes, I'll get you a scope. So my first scope was this single channel scope that there were no leads. You would have to strip a wire and thread it into like I was doing electrical work at home, and thread it like a nut just right across the threads. And my leads were jumper wires with alligator clips soldered onto them. But it was a starting point, and I still remember, connecting it up to like an MC mixture control solenoid on an old GM C3 carburetor, and looking at the duty cycle. I know you can laugh out loud. But that's fine.
What?
That's
Well, what's a carburetor?
Tommy. Yeah, Tommy. You believe me? You're not missing anything.
Yeah,
you're not
I was
missing
in
anything.
that tail end, and I apologize to the audience. My hotspot for some reason decided to conk out, man. So, but I'm back, hopefully.
No issues. But Sean had asked a little bit about background, and I was just and I'll just reinforce this, that I think for a technician today, really regardless of their experience level, it's hard to do anything on a vehicle without making contact with wires and circuits. So, taking some electronics training, not that you necessarily have to get an associate's degree, but take some, DC electronics classes, some AC electronics classes, that can be really beneficial.
Agreed.
That can really, really be helpful because you get the foundation. Yes, you do some math, you run numbers, which is not that hard. Nobody's actually running numbers in the field, but ideally it does help you understand relationships, and that's an important takeaway.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, do you do those calculations on the car? I don't know, probably not too often, but
No.
the relationship between the different parts of the circuit is where if you actually take the time to understand it, like, okay, this makes a little bit more sense. And just working on that for electrical specifically, that like working model in your head, right? That I think you need if you're going to do that stuff. Because if it's an engine or carburetor, right, you take it apart, you have the parts in your hands, and you understand how everything works together. But it's a little tougher for the electrical part. Something like that helps you build that model in your head. So when you're jumping in the car, like you got a picture of how things are going as you're doing the tests and working on it.
Oh yeah, and when you take a class, whether it's 16 weeks or maybe it's it's over a year and a half, whatever the time is, for that period of time that you're doing it all, it's top of mind. You're always hooking up a meter, you're always hooking up a scope, and at some point, and it's different for all of us, we get to a certain level where it's now comfortable, and I sometimes hear people say that, well, it's a hassle to grab a scope. I got to drag it out, or I got to hook it up, or I got to deal with those controls. And yes, if you're not using it on a regular basis, what you say is true. It is a hassle. It's a hassle because I'm not that comfortable with it. I don't have it organized in such a way to make it easy for me. But once you reach that level of comfort, I mean, I think for a lot of techs today, that grabbing a scope is not much more difficult than grabbing a test light. I mean, yeah, it takes a little bit more time to turn it on and to grab, take a test light to a vehicle. But fundamentally, the goal is to achieve that level of comfort, and that only comes with you have to submerge yourself in that for a period of time.
Yep, just gotta put the reps in, and then it just comes naturally. Like, okay, I'm gonna click my settings here, and yeah, you start to not even think about. Exactly. It sort of flows is what you're shooting for.
Yeah. And it's part of your routine. It's part of your approach. It's something, certainly you do not need to use a scope on all problems that we face. Sometimes a test light is the right tool, sometimes an ohm meter, sometimes a voltmeter, sometimes jumper wires and back probing pins. That's all you need, right? It depends on what we're trying to accomplish. So,
I swear I love my power probe too much. But one thing when I started scoping was very good advice. I think it was either Keith LaFazio or Perkins, or I forgot who. I did know it was LaFazio. Now I remember. It's like make it accessible was the biggest advice for me. That's why I built my little cart, because I found that if I had to pull the scope out and then set up the leads and then put it somewhere safe where it doesn't fall or anything, that it was just an extra 15, 20 minutes that I just didn't want to deal with. So I just ended up reverting back to my previous testing methods because it was just easy. So once I actually set up my cart and I was able to, have it there at the ready, then I practiced with it more.
Oh, for sure. If you're in a repair shop, if you work in a repair shop, which obviously the vast majority of technicians do, and you have some type of cart that is set up with your scope, your leads, the appropriate accessories that go with your scope, maybe like a drivability type of cart. Yes, it's going to be easier to grab. If you're a mobile tech, I really know how I work, and that's about the only person I know how I can really say this to. But I have a table. So when I get to a shop, the first thing I do is I open my table. I take my 30 seconds of abuse from the shop owner about when's lunch being served and all this other kind of stuff. And then, the table comes out and I put on what I need to put on: a scan tool, scope, obviously a computer or two is going on the table, and then you go from there. So yeah, you have to have a routine, and you have to have it in such a way that you can just grab it, quickly.
Yeah. I, doing the mobile stuff, I definitely like the U scope for a lot of the stuff. Like obviously if you need the 2 channels, you got to get that set up, but
That for me and so from some other people I know has made it that accessible, like you're talking about. Like it's right there. It's no more difficult than grabbing a meter or a test light or whatever, and boom, you got your pattern. At least you got a starting point. And then for me, that's usually enough to say, okay, I got to ramp it up to something laptop based, or a lot of the time it just gets me the answer that I need.
Yeah, and I know when I've listened to your podcasts over the last few years, you're a fan of the USCO, and
Yeah.
and I know it's a good tool. I actually took a class on it. And who did the teaching a couple years ago at Vision, maybe more. It's probably more than a couple now that I think about it. But for me personally, it's too small. I
Mm-hmm.
can't. I appreciate what it can do, but I'm a little bit spoiled because I want to compute. I have it on a computer. I have a pretty big monitor, and some of the scopes that I've had in the past, Tektronic scopes, had pretty good sized displays. Even though the actual scope, was probably 2/3 of it were buttons, knobs, and things of this nature. But so I'm kind of I like the big screen. I want to be able to mount my Pico set up on a table. I can look through the windshield, maybe do a brake torque or whatever I got to do.
Sure.
But I will agree that if I'm at an A pillar on a Toyota checking out a CAN bus, it would be nice to have something that kind of fits in the corner with me. So I get it. I get that, but it's like anything else. Tommy, you mentioned the Power Probe. I own one. Might be the first Power Probe that was ever sold. Still in my basement. I think Linder gave it to me a long time ago, and I've used them. I've been at repair shops that have had them, and I've used them. But for me, it's not my tool. It's not. Again, nothing
Yeah.
against them. I've seen how they have progressed, how they've created some amazing tools, over the years. But it's something I never really got into, and I felt that I could do it another way, or I
Yeah.
think I could do it another way just as effectively. But it's personal
Yeah, I know.
preference.
Yeah, it's a for me it's like a quick tool, and I've diagnosed like like open can wires and stuff like that just using a power probe. Obviously, I'm not going to look at the voltages and looking at patterns and in the frequency of my waveform. Obviously, that's more like for me that's more of a intermittent communication failure, but like a quick no com test. Yeah, I can kind of quickly see if I have like not so much communication, but like something there. If I don't have anything on my wire, then I know that that wire more than likely is open, and then I kind of go from there.
Yeah, there's no bad test. It's just knowing what each one's capable of or not capable of, and then it makes it a lot, a lot more useful to you in that case. If you don't know those limitations of a test or test method, that's where it might not be the right choice for you in that moment.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
that and that's really
100%.
that, yeah, and that's really the right word, Sean, is limitations. There's a lot of tools that do a really good job at what they're supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
But if you need more or you want more, maybe it's a difference between need and wanting. Then other tools like a scope is a little bit more. Obviously it's bigger. It may take an extra moment, because you can hook it up to a computer. You got to find a place to put that computer, etc. But nonetheless, you can once it's done. Uh, there's a lot that can be done with it, whether it's mechanical testing, fuel, CAN bus, ignition. There's quite a bit to be done with that.
So many of us that listen to the show have taken some of your courses before, and I've always thought you've had a really good uh, way of explaining some of these concepts and topics to people, like we're talking about with the scopes. But whether it's a system on a car or a part, or maybe even introducing something new that we haven't seen before. I think you do a really good job of explaining and breaking these things down, like the complex topics, into a way that like technicians of different skill levels can absorb and make useful back in the shop. When you're building a class or putting something together, do you have a process or a method or something that helps you break these things down and then convey them to technicians in the field? Especially, like I say, with you don't know exactly the skill level range of the people that are going to be sitting in front of you in a given class.
Well, first of all, thank you for the compliment. I do appreciate that. So yes, I have a routine, a guideline that I follow. But before I kind of talk about it, I just want to I personally believe if you're going to talk about a subject, whatever the subject may be, automotive or otherwise, the assumption is that you want to elevate everyone's skill or knowledge. Now, some folks won't need much elevation because they come in knowing quite a bit, if and maybe more than the instructor in some cases. Other folks have maybe a foundation, a little bit of background, but not really a lot yet. So I think when you talk about a subject, you have to include all of the steps, the components, however you want to look at it, to make sure that everybody benefits. So so I do this so to give you an example, if I am learning something, uh, if there's something that I don't know and I'm trying to better understand something I don't know, I will research it. I will document it almost identically to the way that I would present it if I were going to present it. There's many things over the years where I've done research on trying to better understand something. Uh, I'll give you an example. One would be the Chrysler Fiat multi-air hydraulic intake valve control system. So, when that came out, that was really pretty remarkable engineering. And
Yeah.
my friend Scott Manna, shortly thereafter, decided he was going to put together a class on multi-air. So Scott and I have worked together for a long time and getting together on weekends doing research, etc. So, I wanted to going to assist and kind of, follow his lead a little bit. So, in the background, I'm thinking about, okay, multi-air, what is it? So, first of all, you just kind of identify, well, what is multi-air? What is the concept? How is it supposed to work? And then that's your starting point. And that's fairly simple. Usually that's easy to accomplish. Then you look maybe into the mechanical parts of it. Who are the components? How is this, what parts are working together? Then the hydraulics, there's the hydraulic component. Then there's the electrical component, the control component. So you build upon them one at a time. And then as you're trying to learn about it, you organize it. So it's almost like in the old days when we had those yellow pasty notes. I like PowerPoint. And I like PowerPoint because I can do a lot of things with it. But one of the things I can do with a PowerPoint is I can have 10 slides going on hydraulics. I can have 10 slides going on electronics, 10 slides going on mechanical, and then I can arrange them. I can say, this one fits better here. And so it's a little self-serving in that a lot of how I present a class is the way that I want to learn it. So I am lucky in this regard that people seem to accept that. So, and this goes back to the educational background about you identify a problem and then how do you solve the problem? How do you work your way through the problem? How do you get from A to B to C, etc. So it's steps, one thing at a time. So, I actually have a multi-air assembly in my garage that I have a friend who is a local Chrysler fuel service engineer that got a hold of one for me. And it's been a while since I took one apart, but I recently did a class on, it was part of a misfire class. I did a small piece on multi-air, but I had a couple questions and I wanted to take one apart so I could answer my questions. So,
Okay.
So it's, it's one step forward, two steps back type of thing sometimes. But so when I present, I try to present the same way. I try to say, this is what we're going to talk about. This is the big picture, and we're going to break it down into smaller pieces, and each piece is going to build. And then we're going to add some diagnostics, and whether they come at the end or something you might be able to do, depending on the topic. You might be able to talk about a little diag in the middle. I could talk about some diag for mechanical, some diag for electrical, and then you have to have, I think a case study or two. And they don't always have to be broke car case studies. They can be a car that is a known good car, and I'm going to analyze it. And how would I do that? What would be the tools? What would be the methods? What am I interested in? So that would be it, kind of in a nutshell. So, but again, that's lucky. I've not been trained in how to put together a class. I've taken some public speaking classes. I've taken some PowerPoint classes, but I've been pretty lucky, quite honestly, in how I approach putting a class together. And hopefully I've gotten better over time.
Well, I was going to say, I don't think it's wrong to say that you've put a lot of work into it too. You've got the experience on your side there for sure.
Yeah.
So
what was that time?
Go ahead. No, I was saying that as for me, Um, it's really funny because I have these conversations with Pedro a lot because we're two different types of like instructors, and we're two different types of like we do things differently and we learn things differently. And one of the things that always sticks out to me is I tend to like to explain things more, and people in this industry don't like the term, but I figure I say basic a lot because the reality is that's what it is. And one of my only specialty right now is teaching programming. And for one of the things that sticks out with me is like I actually teach you how to install the software. Like in my class, I have a whole section of how to install the software. And a lot of people are just like, oh, they can do that on their own. They can figure it out. And so I was kind of hesitant to do it, but then I'm just like, you know what, man? If it's good or bad, it's mine. Like I did it. This is what I think is best. And you have no idea how much positive feedback I've gotten from people saying, "Hey, I'm glad you told me where to find it because I can't find this. I've tried looking and it just doesn't easily pop up for me." So there's something to be said about the different teaching styles and the breakdown of it all.
Well, to your point, if somebody was going to talk about how to install IDS, FDRS, it wouldn't be that difficult. But if somebody's going to talk about how to install Otis, that might be more challenging.
Could be a class on
Right.
that.
So, you would need, especially, today Otis is different, but when it was first released to the aftermarket, it was a heck of a challenge to get that, because I was an early user of Otis. So, to be able to get that to work. And, I think some of the folks today, they've got good support now. You can call Otis, somebody will answer, somebody will help you.
Travis.
But early on, it was a little bit more difficult, not to mention the time in between going through the steps. I mean, it was laid out nicely, on the web. And once you did it and you figured some things out, it wasn't that bad. The next time you had to put it on a different computer, but still, a class would be quite helpful in that regard. So,
Yeah,
it's always,
agreed.
right. It's always the topic. There's always going to be the topic is going to demand more background information. Some topics less, some topics more. And ultimately, the instructor has to make that decision because the instructor is responsible for the content. And the challenge, of course, with any class is time. It's never on our side. So,
No.
for whatever reason, in the aftermarket, classes are generally 3 to 3.5 hours. That is a very common one. There are some organizations that are 45 minutes, but more often than not, it's 3 hours. I saw your expression there, Sean.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was involved with one of those once, but usually it's a few hours. So you have a window, and I think all instructors have a tendency to pack the window. I want to cover as much as I can, but the reality is, as an instructor, I might think there are 10 items that are important for this topic, and I feel strongly that I got to cover 10. But after you practice, you create, you can only get 6 of them in. And this is what it's got to be. We're not a 16-week training program. It's not like going back to a junior college or signing up for something. You don't have 16 weeks. Sean, you taught at a junior college. I taught
Yeah.
at a junior college. So there's a big difference when you have 16 weeks, as it may not be 16, but when you have, let's say, a semester to teach drivability or to teach automatic transmissions. You've got time. You've got a lot of time to slowly build. But if you're taking a class like the classes that I do, the classes that you guys both do, you got to be pretty narrow. You have to really define what it is you want to deliver. And if you spend more time doing this, there's less time for something else. And
Right.
we all struggle with that. There's no answer to this. It's ultimately the instructor decides. But
Yeah.
that's tough. That's never going to change.
And, like you say, with a college, you have the time to verify, hey, did they understand? Like you can assess, did they get those concepts? Can they actually apply this stuff? Where in a 4-hour class, that's a little bit more challenging. do you build in questions to see where everybody's at, and then how much time are you leaving? Because the questions can obviously derail where you were hoping your time would be spent on that particular topic. So yeah, it's sometimes a little bit of a juggling act to keep that all straight.
One of the most enjoyable classes that I have done, throughout my training career have been hands-on lab scope classes. And I do them today much differently than I did when I first started doing them. Because I believed when I first started doing a hands-on lab scope class that we needed at least 4 hours of classroom. There were so many things to talk about. And then we will go out into the shop. Today, I make sure that it's no more than 90 minutes in the classroom at the beginning of the morning, and then the rest of the time is hands-on. But it's not random. I have worksheets. I know exactly what cars are going to be in the class. I've got the groups broken up, and they all have tasks to do. And I recognize that I can give them some basics in the morning for 90 minutes, enough if they're not comfortable, enough to at least get them started, make a few points. But the real education occurs when we go out in the shop and they follow the worksheets. You're not just going to randomly, poke wires and what did I get? You got to have a plan. And I've done this, I've had help many times over the years. Like again, Scott Manna has helped me and others do classes. But one of the things that it's always remarkable is that so once we break from the classroom, we'll go out to the shop and get on the cars. We're moving at a slow pace. And I have, generally, I don't like more than 4 technicians to a car. So we might have 24 people, 6 cars, 4 guys. And myself and, a couple of other gentlemen are assisting, and we're walking around and we're helping them kind of get going, how to do this, how to set the time. Okay, I remember you said it, but I don't really get it. So it's slow. But it's always amazing, and it's pretty consistent with most of these classes I've done now over the years, that after lunch we pick up the pace dramatically. Matter of fact, I'm pretty sure I can leave the class early and nobody would notice. That I can just get out of there because they're cruising right along. And I really, now when I'm walking around, I'm just looking over the shoulder, just kind of making sure that not too much friendly conversation. Focus on scope stuff, but you can see the difference. So getting back to assessment, I can't do that in a 3-hour class, because if I do, and I've seen others do it, and I appreciate the effort to do that, but in my mind, if I try to assess in a 3-hour window and that assessment takes 15 minutes, that's 15 minutes I'm not talking about the topic.
Yeah.
So I can't do it. But in an 8-hour class with hands-on, you can see improvement as you work your way, as the day progresses. And that is really, that's great feedback, for an instructor to be able to say, what, this gentleman came in, he was maybe a little bit comfortable, but not very, but now he's moving well. And if he continues that pace back in the shop, he's got skills that he'll have now for the rest of his career, as long as he uses those.
Awesome. Now, when teaching, and forgive me if this question was earlier, when teaching, what do you think is the most difficult concept or techniques that us technicians struggle to learn the most?
Yeah, you had that question down in what you sent me, and it's I think that's a really hard question to answer in terms, what's difficult. I let me kind of turn this around a little bit, and let me talk about this from a diagnostic viewpoint. Then we can talk about training. So one of the things I've noticed over the years when it comes to diagnosing vehicles, and my focus is, Sean, similar to yours. I do mostly drivability, a body electrical, immobilizer, and programming. So I'm going to leave programming out of this discussion. But I think what can be challenging for maybe less experienced technicians is, what is the first step? How do I make sure that the first thing that I do is going to help me push forward in the right direction? How do I stay on path? Because I don't want to be randomly, for example, if I have a no start, maybe if it's a Monday, I check spark first. If it's a Tuesday, I use carb spray. What is the routine? And all of us, when we start out, we don't have a routine. Now, there's probably somebody in the shop smarter than us, more experienced than us, that can say, do this. or do that. And maybe we can piggyback on that. But I think, and I always try to remember this when I do classes, is that if I'm going to diagnose a CAN bus issue or a direct injection issue, what is the logical, easy to understand, makes good sense first step? What do I got to do that kind of gets me in the right direction? Because you don't want to be jumping around. And I've had this conversation in shops, and I suspect you guys have had it as well. Is, well, how did you know to do this? You know, how did you know to go here and not there? Why did you check? Why did you chase fuel as opposed to chasing spark? Or why did you do a cranking current test when you put the scan tool down? You know, that is important to learn, and that's not, you don't learn that in a class. You know,
Right.
you learn that through many classes and over time. You know, I've always believed that the shop is the best classroom. You know, that's where we learn. Now we can support that with taking classes. We can support that with reading trade mags. I realize there's not many of them left. Watching YouTube videos, you know, participating or even not participating in some of the online forums like diag.net and others. You know, there's a lot of them out there these days, and that's good. And we should be taking advantage of all of that, you know, looking at all of those resources. But ultimately, we have to take what we've learned from others, however we got that information, and figure out relative to our personal approach, how do I incorporate this? You know, what are the things that I do? So to answer your question, I know it's long-winded, Tommy, that if I'm doing a class and the class is on a specific topic, I would like to make sure that in that class, I address how using scan data that it's going to move us in this direction. Because everybody starts with a scan tool. Yes, I mean, somebody's got to talk to the consumer. The complaint has to be understood. And you got to pull codes. I'm not going to worry too much about that. But you have to start with the scan tool. You have to use the scan tool as efficiently as possible. And generally speaking, this is not always the case, but generally speaking, if a technician thinks about a car that they were challenged, that they feel, and I feel this way frequently, this car took me too much time, or I had a misstep. If I go back and analyze what I did, which I do frequently, when I go back and I think about the steps, and I can say to myself, this is where I made my mistake. I assumed this, or I thought this, and this was incorrect. And I'm going to try to avoid that in the future. Let me give you an example. Is that okay?
Yes.
Of course.
Car example?
Of course. Yeah, of course.
So this past week, or it was a week ago, I can't remember now. But anyway, in the last week or so, a shop asked me to assist them with a 2018 Q5 that ran horribly. And it is a 2-liter CCTA engine. So it's a newer vehicle with older technology, 2-liter turbo. Still uses measuring blocks. So it still has measuring blocks. And I'm using the Rostec VCDS scan tool for this. And the shop had told me that they were chasing misfires on cylinders 1 and 4. And, and they did some stuff, and that stuff, and what if they did is not important, but they did a bunch of stuff, and they were in order to diagnose misfires on 1 and 4. And I have some experience with VW, and there's certain things that I've learned that it's always a good idea to check. And those are the adaptations, whether it be fuel trim adaptations and cam timing adaptations. So I'm sure many of your listeners know, if you're working on a VW in, let's say, expert mode on a snap-on scan tool or like a Rostec type of tool, group or block 93 shows what I call the wear and tear pit. And it shows the actual position in crank degrees that the cam is out relative to where it's supposed to be. Now, there's another block that shows actual and desired. And surprisingly, the actual is not correct. It's like 28 degrees, but they just show that even though the cam's out. But in block 93, they show the delta, the distance, and that was 60 degrees. And that number means that the intake cam is advanced 60 degrees. And if you advance an intake cam 60 degrees, that's excessive valve overlap. And you will have extremely low vacuum. And theoretically, all 4 cylinders should be misfiring. But I saw the same thing that they told me. When I went to the misfire counters, it was 1 and 4. It wasn't 2 and 3. It should have been 2 and 3, but I didn't verify this with, like using a crank sensor or putting a transducer in the tailpipe to verify what cylinder. I know it's running rough, but it was interesting how the scan tool did throw them a curve. I will say that. And the misfires were, there was misfired codes, 300 and 301, 304. But my point of this conversation is, had they been a little bit more familiar with how VW does things, what this Group 93 is, they would have said, okay, it's a cam timing problem. And then a little research would have said the maximum phase angle on an intake cam is 60 degrees. So the chance that the cam is out 60 and the maximum is 60 pretty much says it's a control issue. And there was a problem with, I'll use the term loosely, the bolt, the control valve that holds the sprocket, to the camshaft inside what's called a bearing bridge. I'm sure you're very familiar with that. But my point is that understanding the data, and obviously there was a day one for me where I did not know what Group 93 was, let alone what a phase angle was. So it takes time. Kind of unusual for me. This shop was very interested in what I did, how I did it. So the technician was working with me, and I was happy to say, here's how we're going to do it. So the goal was, before I get out of the car, we're going to have a pretty good idea on what's wrong with the vehicle. And that's my goal in every car. Now, it doesn't always work out that way. What my goal would be, a good first step is, can I eliminate ignition? Can I eliminate fuel? Can I do something that says this is probably the most logical thing to check? Without doing the silver bullet thing. Don't get me wrong, silver bullets are fine. We all like them. I don't mind using them. That's fine. But at some point, we have to kind of train ourselves to develop a routine. And one piece of this, and I know, Tommy, you asked me regarding training, but training is, you step back from the diag world. So that means that if I was going to do a VW class, one of the things I would talk about is, before you look at the codes. I know everybody's going to do that, but before you erase the codes, which on those cars clears the adaptations, why don't we look at the adaptations? Why don't we look at the multiplicative, the additive, the short term, and variable cam timing? Why don't we look at that and just make that part of my routine? So that's part of when I do those cars. I don't care if they run good or they run bad. I look at those adaptations before I blow the codes up. And there's a number of other things I want to look at as well in those cars, but that would be a piece of it. So that would be, so from a training viewpoint, if you're going to train on that particular topic, you have to include that. You'd have to make sure that gets covered, and what it means, the importance of the 60 degrees. Now, it's not always 60 degrees, but on that car, it is 60 degrees. And there's a lot of those CCTAs floating around that, with a little practice, you get payback very quickly.
Yeah, and something you mentioned in there, and I think you were talking about Matt with this too. I was listening to your podcast with him where you're looking back on what you did on that particular vehicle, right? What was my process? Once you got to the fix, maybe there was some, stumbling blocks along the way. Maybe I made the wrong call here or misstep or wasted time, but then taking the time afterwards to look back on that and then document some of that stuff. So you document somewhere that, hey, block 93 is an important thing to look at on these Volkswagens so that you have it. But that is a really powerful thing that I introduced into my process somewhere along the way. That's made a huge difference to stuff that comes up in the future. And that's for me, like kind of how I help build my process too, is all of those experiences, but then really looking at what was the beneficial test here. What did I do that wasted time? And then next time, making it a little bit better. There's some older General Motors products. Hummer was one that we saw recently. There's a 2-amp fuse that powers the theft deterrent module that pops a lot of the time. Well, that power feed goes to the BCM on one leg, and depending on the diagram that you're looking at, it doesn't show you that it goes in and then back out on another circuit. And I got burnt by that the first time that I was looking at it, but then we just had one the other day. So like, as soon as they say it, I'm like, okay, I need to make sure that I, look to see, okay, yes, this has got another leg that goes out to another part of the, under the hood. And that's where the short was. But that came from, getting my ass kicked on one and then actually writing it down to say, hey, if you have this, in the future to look for this, or this is something that you need to be aware of on this one, because it's an easy tripwire to hit,
Yeah. And I think, and I know it's hard, So I will preface what I'm about to say is that this is hard and it's time consuming.
Mm-hmm.
But when a technician has an interesting, difficult diagnostic that they have correctly diagnosed and the vehicle's fixed, I think it's important to document the process. So when I was talking with Matt, I talked about, years ago before I knew how to use a computer, I put everything in manila folders. And I have a filing cabinet, right next to my toolbox, in the bay, and it was filled with vehicles by VIN. But today I do everything in PowerPoint. It's just because I learned how to use PowerPoint, and I'm not an expert, but I can kind of make it work for me. But I'm nonstop capturing scan data. Now, if I'm using like a GM GDS2, I don't have to capture anything because the tool captures for me. Once
Yep.
it saves everything. But some tools like the Autel tool, and I'm constantly pressing the capture button in the lower center part, and I'm capturing screens. I'm capturing screens that I think are important, and I will capture service information. If I was using any other type of tool, but I'm going to try to capture everything that I did, and then later that evening, hopefully, I will put that all into a PowerPoint, and it won't necessarily be class ready. It's not going to be polished, but it'll have the vehicle info, the date, the shop, the complaint, all my photographs, anything picture I took. Thank goodness for cell phones, right? You can take a picture of anything quickly. I got
Mm-hmm.
pictures of everything, where things are, and then all the data, and then I have to come to a conclusion. I did, or my scope saves. I did this. Whatever this was, and I really, really, truly believe that makes us better. I'm not trying to be as good as anybody else. I just want to be better tomorrow than I am today. That's how I just want to incrementally improve my skills. And if you do it long enough, and if you work hard at it long enough, and time favors us, we will change. We will get better and better and better. And you don't know if you're doing, there was a time when I first started doing mobile, like 25 years ago, that I would do a lot of cars in a day. And the numbers are not important, but for me, it was a lot of cars in the day. It was a long, long day. And in the last few years, kind of since COVID, I have reduced the quantity intentionally. I don't want to do that many cars anymore. But I have kind of filtered out what I kind of suspect are cars that are, I don't know, they're just say, I'll use the word rough. And I'll just leave it at that. They're in that category. I'm not that
Yeah.
interested in. So what I'm doing today is more quality. I'm doing less vehicles. I'm doing a better job at charging than I used to do as well. So I've evolved, as I'm sure both you have. It took me a while to evolve, but I finally have evolved. So it's easier if I'm only doing, let's say, 4 or 5 cars a day, max. But only so that's easier to do that. But if somebody's diagnosing 12, 15 cars a day, some of them are going to be routine, blown
Mm-hmm.
fuse, connector not plugged in, but others will be interesting. And to dig into that and to understand that's where the learning takes place. And that's what makes us better. And that's, as the saying goes, sharpens the stone. And that helps kind of not guarantee, but at least it pushes us that when we step out of the car after studying scan tool data, I have a pretty darn good idea what I'm going to do next. And more likely than not, it's going to move me in the right direction.
Yeah, for sure. is is that how that your main method as far as like staying up on what's current or what's relevant in the automotive industry is the stuff that you're working on doing mobile?
Yes. So there, I have two answers to this. I am like you. We probably work on a mix of vehicles. I still work on some older stuff. I work on, maybe 2015, 2020 is a big chunk of vehicles. But I also have my used car lot customers, auction customers that have 23s and 24s. So when I do something on a 23 or a 24, that's now homework. Hopefully I can figure it out, but I see, and maybe I'm working on something that has nothing to do with what I identify, but what I identify is something I don't understand. I don't know how this works. I haven't seen this before. I want to understand that. For example, on GM four-cylinder truck and car, they introduced a new variable valve lift system. So they years ago on the 2.5 LKW engine, they had a variable valve lift system, and then they had it on the 3.6, kind of like a DoD approach, but then they came out with like a clean sheet, and it's based on the VW Audi sliding cam element design. So, which I'm familiar with that because those have been around for many years now, but I was not familiar with this system on these GMs. So that became homework. So I have devoted time to researching those vehicles. And I have good relationships with college instructors at the local junior colleges, and one of them is a GM school, and he let me in for I don't know, it was 4 or 5 hours to research a Chevy truck 2.7 turbo with this variable valveless system. And prior to doing that, prior to going to the school to actually look at one, I spent a huge amount of time going through GMSI, going through the codes, because sometimes with General Motors, they have good information, but they don't always have it in the same location on every vehicle. So you got to read, you got to read. And so I spent a lot of time reading. I had a yellow pad of questions that I didn't understand what I was reading. So when I got to the vehicle, I learned that some of what GM had printed was incorrect. What they said was not true. And some of what they said, of course, was true. So that was, to answer your question, so that was self-development. But I needed the vehicle to do that. And if I had to work on one of those vehicles that was broke, that I had never experienced, I had to work on it, maybe I could figure it out. Probably not on the first visit. Maybe on the third visit, I'd get it,
Yeah.
But but because in between those visits, it's on top of mind, you're doing homework. So for me, I kind of stumble across new technology, and I think to myself, I need to know more about that. So I will get it in the queue, so to speak, and hopefully get a handle on it. Whether it becomes a class or not is unimportant. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't.
So
Go ahead.
sorry.
Go ahead, Tommy.
So every time you do a one of these special diagnostics or diags, you prepare like you approach it like you're going to teach a class, or does it just come after the fact that you're done researching and you fix the vehicle?
So for example, tomorrow is Monday for our listeners here, and I've got cars on the schedule. I know what those cars are. I know what the issues are. I have already created PowerPoints for those cars, and I have already pulled what I think are the appropriate wiring diagrams. So one of them is a Cadillac with a P0641, which is a shorted 5-volt supply for 5-volt supply number 1. So I already have the diagrams pulled. I've already identified where the connectors are if I need to. So I've already kind of got a game plan developed. So when I get there, my goal is to execute. I'm not going to be thinking about the problem. I'm not going to be reading about the problem. I'm going to be diagnosing the problem. So
Understood.
that would be example. And so will that ever get used in a class? Maybe. But anytime I do the diag, I'm not worried about it. Is it going in a class or not? I'm worried about my goal is to get it fixed. I want to do the best I can and get this diagnosed for the repair shop efficiently. I want to get in there and kind of get out
Yeah.
for their benefit.
There's two. Some of these shops suck.
What does
Sorry.
what does dictate whether something's gonna become a class for you? I mean, do you get requests from the industry on stuff, or is it just, hey, we're seeing a ton of this, shops are getting beat up on that? Where does it come in for you?
Yeah, so that's a pretty interesting question. Automotive seminars, Tim and I and his son Pete, every year we do a survey on classes. So we send a survey out to hundreds of individuals, asking them. Now we give them a list. So there's a list of maybe 20 topics, and we can't do 20 topics. But we send it out, and we'll get some feedback on that. But I also get feedback when I'm in a shop and I'm talking to techs or shop owners, and they'll say, this is an issue, or this is an issue. And so I'll hear that. And if I'm on, let's say, Diagnostic Network, and I'm reading questions and responses, and I see a couple of things popping up, same thing is popping up, it pops up again, different people, maybe different vehicles, but a similar concern. I think to myself, that's, I may not have experienced it yet, or maybe I have, but that might be something to consider. So I do have a list of potential topics that, I got to make sure they're relevant. And I can't deliver a topic because I'm a fan of the topic. It's got to be a topic that people will find beneficial. So, Sean, I'll give you a good example. one that I know is near and dear to you from listening to your podcast, and that is the second generation Pentastar 3.6 liters.
Yeah. The old camshaft.
So now, so this is interesting. So if a technician has never run into typically bank one, high lift, intake cam low wear, if they've never run into that before and they reach out for help, there will be somebody to help them. Because now, here we are today, 2025, this is a reasonably well-known issue. So many shops know, and certainly hotlines know, forums know that the cam lobes on this particular engines like to wear down. So that's pretty well known. Now, a few years ago, it wasn't well known. And I remember you had a gentleman on your podcast, this could be going back 2 or 3 years, that had assisted you or had reached out to you when you were dealing with one.
Yep.
So I listened, I don't remember that gentleman's name, but I remember that conversation. So what I find interesting about that, if one is going to talk about that, and I still think it's valuable to talk about because they're still out there, they're not going away anytime soon, there's two interesting issues that come out of that diagnosis. One is, let's assume bank one intake cam lobes have all worn on bank one. So one issue is, why does bank two cylinders misfire? So typically, what I see when I run into this issue is that bank one that has the worn lobes, those cylinders never misfire.
Right.
Bank two cylinders misfire. So that's one question. The second question is, why is bank one lean? So commonly, and then when I say lean, I should say before correction. So commonly, when you look at the learned long-term correction on bank one, it's I usually see around maybe 16 to 20%, rough ballpark. That captures a lot of them. But when you go to bank two, that's misfiring, the trim correction may be slightly negative, but not a problem. It's good. So the question is, what has happened with these worn lobes? We know what the problem is. We know what's broke. It needs a camshaft plus a host of other things. But why? What has this problem done? How has it manifested itself in such a way that the other bank misfires, and the bank that's bad has such a positive trim correction? So that's real. So if I talk about that, I want to talk about those clues. I want to say that if I'm in the vehicle and this is the issue that I have, yes, I'm going to do a cranking current test and or possibly cranking vacuum test, and that should pretty much nail it. But how am I going to use a scan data that says when you come out of the car, this is what you're going to do? So, it's kind of interesting to talk about that conceptually. And I think you had that conversation, right? I'm not trying to, put you. It's been at least 2 years, maybe longer.
Well, we've seen quite a few of them. Actually, I just had a couple in the last few weeks. And yeah, so every time that you hit a shop and these guys are getting beat up on them that haven't seen them before, right? If your first time going through that, like you say, the misfires are on the side that's good. And then the PCM's always shutting down the injectors on those too. And so we get calls like, hey, it needs a computer. That's usually the call that we get. And then
Okay.
But like we mentioned, you have the previous ones documented. So we have the test, like we look at the scan data. Okay, we see the trims. We do the relative compression. Okay, we see that. We're looking at the peak to valley and all of that. But going through it the first time, like, because guys, now when we go into one, like, we have a pretty good sense of it, right, where we're going with it. We get there quickly, and the techs in the shops are like, oh man, I've been getting beat up on this, and I have to go back. I'm like, yeah, I got beat up on it too, man, the first time, but here's what we did to document the process so that we know what to look for. And that's the key. Okay, we got this, confirm, okay, pull the valve cover, but yeah, those are tricky ones, and there's plenty of stuff out there. There's another like thing like that waiting for me tomorrow that I've never seen before. That's gonna get me. I have a 23 Maserati at the shop right now. That's getting me currently. So
you'll have to share with that. I don't know anything about those vehicles.
Somebody jump started it backwards. It's got the 48 volt hybrid, so we're learning on that one for sure. Lots of reading and education.
Absolutely. So, Tommy, let me relate this conversation back to your question. So let's say that somebody decides that they should do a training class on the Pentastar with the worn intake lobes. So one of the things that would be really important to talk about is from a mechanical viewpoint, the importance of when an intake valve closes. So you think about the 4 valve events and you focus in on when an intake valve closes. And when you have a worn cam lobe, assuming that it's not worn completely, the intake valve closing will occur earlier. And a lot of techs have run into this. But what's interesting about the Pentastar, because it has Gen 2, is it has variable valve lift. The center high lift lobes can only wear so low. And what stops them from wearing any lower are the 2 adjacent low lift lobes. And they have a delayed intake valve closing, which causes higher compression, which means the bad bank has higher compression than the good bank, bank 2, and that's why the good bank, bank 2, misfires. Bank 1 being the fact that it has higher compression, the only way you get higher compression is you have more air mass. There's more air being packed into the cylinder. Well, if you pack more air in, you need a greater fuel correction, which is why that bad bank has a positive trim number. So from a training viewpoint, yes, you should talk about the worn cam lobe. We should talk about what the clues are in the scan data, and the conversation has to include what really makes all this happen is when the intake valve closes. That's what has changed. So understanding the importance of intake valve closing is really the foundation for understanding the scan data, for understanding the problem. So I think an instructor, the instructor would be, their responsibility would be, you have to include that. That ties it together, and that means the next time I have an issue like that, maybe it's a Maserati, I don't know. But the next time I have, a situation like that, I'm not trying to memorize worn cam lobes. Now I understand, okay, an intake valve closing point that changes is going to impact compression, it's going to impact trims, and it's going to impact possibly another bank, assuming, there is another bank for misfire. So it's the foundation. I think as an instructor, it's not just about the car, it's about the principles. And we have to remember that, to include the principles. May have given you a little bit more than what you wanted.
No, that's perfect.
Didn't want to bog it down, which I think I kind of did,
No.
but
No, that was perfect.
Is there any like systems or topics that you avoid teaching about, or maybe that you just don't enjoy teaching as much, that maybe you've given it a shot in the past, you're like, okay, this one doesn't work, or it's not for me?
There are topics that I have discussed in the past. ABS brakes, for example, automatic transmission controls, to the valve body level, and I enjoyed them, but they weren't popular. They didn't, the audience, or, our attendees did not seem to care. Now that was then, this is now, so there could certainly have been a change of heart. But Sean, I will answer this question, and this is very sincere. I will never teach something that I'm not interested in. Because if somebody says to me, John, I'll give you a great example. John, you need to teach EV, electric vehicle. You need to teach this technology. No, I'm not going to do it. I have absolutely no experience with it. I appreciate what's happening. I appreciate, I've been to Seth Thorson's class. Phenomenal job. Great class. You want EV training? Call Seth as an example. Not me. That I don't understand it. I'm not that interested in it. I would never do that class. So I will only talk about things that I understand, I have experience with, my hands have touched, and I enjoy. So to be fair, I can't say that, a CAN bus class is more interesting than a coil on plug class. To me, if I'm going to talk about it, I enjoy the topic. And so that would be, so you only see me teach about things I like.
Okay.
If I'm not teaching it, I don't understand it, or I'm not into it, to be quite honest. So,
that's good.
and you know what? That's the truth, right? It seemed like it's same with my job, my day job. I'm a mobile diagnostic tech. Don't call me if you have a problem with brakes, other than maybe hybrid stuff. But I'm not there. I'm not really qualified to help you with a brake issue, or I have a vibration. There's great NVH guys out there. I know some of them, but I'm not that guy. Do not call me for that. I'll recommend someone else that'll help you. It's not going to be me. So.
Yeah.
I'm curious about one thing, since you've, as Sean so eloquently put, you've been training for some time now. What are your thoughts on in person versus online?
Well, I should have done online sooner. I should have incorporated online sooner. So I will tell you that, obviously, COVID forced us to do something else. Uh, and I think online training is good for a number of reasons. One is that those that are a far distance from metro areas can get training relatively easily. So you can be, in the middle of nowhere, USA, and where nobody ever visits, and you can get training. Sean, when I used to go up to Minneapolis to do classes, there were three gentlemen that used to drive hours. They would stay overnight at the hotel to take
Oh
a
wow.
class. Yeah. Yeah. And I
Wow.
always appreciated that because they were giving up a huge amount of time away from the shop and money, to do that. So certainly one benefit of online training is that folks who may not have had the opportunity to ever receive any training because of their location, that problem is resolved. So now
Sure.
you can take training, if you want to, you can take training on just about any topic. Um, but what I really miss is the camaraderie of visiting, whether it be a school or a hotel or a shop and doing the classes. I've been really fortunate. I've done this for a long time, and I have met hundreds and hundreds of people, and some of them are acquaintances. I see them when I came out to Minneapolis. There was a certain core group of people that I would see. Sometimes those folks would call me on the phone. I got to know them a little bit. That's how I met Matt, of course, up there,
Oh, I'm
and that was
sorry.
true everywhere I. But everywhere I went, there was somebody kind of like Matt, not quite like Matt, but kind of like Matt.
No,
That
no, you're never
that I
gonna find nobody like Matt, man. I'm sorry.
that's not, I try to choose my words carefully, but that I got to know pretty well. Dan Baumhart from currently with ASE. Dan has been a longtime friend, and I met him doing a training class at the time. He owned a repair shop in the Milwaukee area. Had two at one time, but that's how I got to meet Dan, and the list goes on and on. So I've been super fortunate to have met really great people in this industry because of that. And then, of course, so I'm doing this, and then you get to a Linder event. So this is like my
Man.
first event that I was presenting at. And my gosh, the floodgates open. I met all sorts of people like, Mark Warren. I remember reading Mark's articles, in the trade mag. Jim Wilson, who's now currently with Standard Motor Products, Lance Mossman, who sells some Snap-on tools today, but it was a highly skilled tech out in Lansing, Michigan. So the list can go on and on and on. But I had this
Wow.
tremendous opportunity to meet people, and a lot of the names that I see maybe on Diagnostic Network, I know these people. I don't know them well, but I know them. Something like Scott Brown. I've been to dinner with Scott and his wife when I was out in California. He came to Chicago one time. We had what we used to call years ago a Pico Day, where Scott would host at his shop. Sometimes 20 guys would show up, and we would spend the weekend doing research or trying to develop skills. So there was a huge benefit to in-person training for me. And the other part is, when you do an online training class, you don't know what the feedback is. Yes, there's a chat box, which I don't pay attention to because I really can't do two things at once. I can only focus
Hmm.
on the class. But when you're in person, I can look at someone's face, and I made it a point. You have to make eye contact. Whether it's a class of 5 or a class of 250, you got to stroll the room, and you're trying to determine, is your point being understood? Are there people maybe shaking their heads in agreement? Are some people? Sometimes you can tell. Sometimes people got great poker faces. You can't tell, but you get that feedback. Plus, if you want to ask a question, you ask a question in real
Mm-hmm.
time. So, but I will say, and I've heard many people tell me this, that one of the benefits to online training, at least the way that we do it, I'm sure others do it in a similar way, is that once you own the class, it's in your library. So if you purchase a class and you want to watch it again a year later, or you want to share it with a newly hired technician 2 years later, it's there. Just go ahead and watch it.
Hmm.
So the one thing about in person is if you miss it, you miss it. You're not going to it.
Yeah,
So
that's a huge benefit of the way, at least like you say, you guys have it structured, is that I can go back and watch that video a couple years later, or even just a portion of it, right? Like, oh, I know John had a case study on this, and then as I'm driving the vehicle, I can, learn up on that or refresh myself on it before I do it. Because maybe you hear something in class and then you never see that car, or you don't see it for 2 years, and then it's like, what was the thing where he did the, and yeah, being like, a book is good, but to actually like have you explain it, in my ear, that's huge. So that is definitely the advantage. But I don't think you could be as skilled as delivering the content had you not done it in front of people, the in person. Like you say, that feedback from people in your class is so huge.
I feel attacked. I've done more online than in person training.
Well, it's again, if I was to make an analogy, if I'm a technician and I am fortunate enough to do a lot of diagnostics, over time, if I work hard, I will get better at it. So if I'm an instructor, I'm not a teacher, but I'm an instructor. If I'm an instructor and I've had the opportunity to develop and deliver classes over a long period of time, and I like what I do, and I want to get better at it, that experience is valuable. So I agree with you. There's something to be said for being in front of a group and work. It's a skill. You don't know it at the time necessarily when you're doing it, but when you look back, you say, what I do today is a heck of a lot different than what I did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, et cetera, or even how it was done. I started training with an overhead projector and a piece of plastic that was called an acetate. So
I'm in my head thinking that he started off with one of those projectors I had when I was in elementary school, and you beat me to it.
Oh yeah, it was an overhead projector and an acetate. And believe me,
Wow.
that was not the first version. It used to be those rotary slides. What was it? It wasn't 16 millimeter. It was lights out. I remember taking AC Delco classes like this. It was lights out in an auditorium. They had a projector with I forget the name, escapes me, but it was a rotary slide that held slides, and they would drop in. They would make a weird clicking noise, and you couldn't even see the instructor. All you could see was the slide. It was so dark. So I never did that. I missed that version, but I went right to the overhead projector.
What was the first class that you presented at a professional level?
Well, when you say professional, do you mean I got paid to do it?
Yeah.
or it was actually a professional delivery.
Your first paid event. What was that?
All right. Well, this is not what you're going to want to hear, but I'll tell you that anyway. The very first class I ever did that I actually received compensation for was a Know Your Car class for women.
Okay.
Through Triton College. And I had, again, this instructor who was really Ray Oviac, a name I mentioned earlier in our conversation. He had asked me, he got hold of me after, I was out of school, that would I mind doing this class? Nobody there would do it, I guess. And, I was probably 22, maybe, when I did this class. I can't even remember what I talked about. All I remember, I had a car and I had a small group of women. I helped them talk about pretty much things they wanted to know. So, and I got compensated. So that was professional, I guess.
Nice.
But that's, I didn't even know I would like it, but I did enjoy that. It was very simple, but I actually enjoyed it. And that was the starting point. And I'll just add a little bit more. So back then, this was the 80s. Triton College used to have an organization within the college called Employee Development Institute. And the goal was to connect the college to the community. And they did this in many areas. They wanted to do this in automotive. So they decided they were going to do some training for the industry sponsored by the college. And they contacted me and they asked me if I'd be interested in presenting this. So I think one of the first classes I did, it was early on anyway, was GMC3, computer controlled carburetor, Tomi, carburetor. That's what was the class. and believe it or not, this was a 5-night class, Monday through Friday. in the
Jesus.
evening, so maybe 3 hours. And the way the class was, the first 3 nights, let's say we had 30 people. The first 3 nights were all together in the classroom, and I went through C3. Now, this is back in the day when we would spend time on a temperature sensor. We would spend time on a throttle position sensor, secondary air, mixture control. This was, all new technology. And then what was really good about this is the second 2 nights, Thursday and Friday, we split the group in half and we did hands-on. And this is where I learned about the importance of worksheets if you're going to do a hands-on training class. So when the group would come in on Thursday, we had 1 or 2 cars. The school, again, it was a GM program, so the cars was never an issue. And I had put together a worksheet, and I wanted to, for example, use a multimeter and a scan tool, like an all test back then, and just, get coolant temp and then back probe the sensor and measure the voltage. Sweep a TP with the scan tool, then go to the sensor and do it with a voltmeter. And then the second half would be on a Friday. So that's really kind of that might have been the catalyst for how I thought about training back then. Now, I was following the GM method. So GM had CC3 training. They had the acetates already made that I would put on the projector. So it really wasn't my work. They had done the work. It was similar to what a GM dealer tech would get if they would go to the GM training center for 8 hours. So, the material was kind of developed. I did a few things, but as time went on, I wanted to make it my own. So eventually I was able to do that. But we did that for a number of years, and we did, some Ford stuff, some Chrysler stuff, and it was all in the evening. But I thought it was really good. It was really good in that we got information was made available. That's not done anymore. That's not provided anymore, unfortunately. So
That's cool.
That's kind of how it got started.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
When you mentioned LinderTech, that one kind of hit me in the feels a little bit, man, because I knew about LinderTech, and it was in Indianapolis, so it was only like a 3-hour car ride for me, and
Correct. Yeah.
I had a lot of unresolved social anxiety way back when, and I was definitely afraid of going. I was definitely afraid of going because I didn't know anybody. I didn't really know anybody in the industry. I remember hopping on IATN a couple times, and I saw a lot of these like very very like IATN. I call it like the Xbox chat group of automotive world back in the day because man, it was brutal. You had to come back in the ATN days. You had to come correct, man. Like I mean, you had to dot your I's and cross your T's. If not, you were gonna get panned out of there. So I just like I never had the balls to post anything. I was just reading, hopefully find something similar to my problem, and of course there should never be any regrets because things happen for a reason. But I definitely do regret not making it to a LinderTech conference. I heard they were just hands down amazing.
Well,
Hey, have you ever been faced with the challenge of sourcing, installing, and programming a used control module in a vehicle? I know a lot of us have. It seems to be happening more and more often today with the volume of control modules on vehicles, the cost of some new ones, or even the availability of new control modules. In some cases, used may be the only option. So what do you do here? I strongly recommend checking out SJ Auto Solutions and Tomi Oliva. Tomi offers a cloning service for used control modules to make these things plug and play for the vehicle that you're working on. In a lot of cases, he is also able to source the control modules if you're unable to locate one for the vehicle that you're working on. But once you get connected with Tomi, he's going to offer fantastic support from start to finish to make sure that that control module is going to work in your application. He's also got tech support that he offers through his website, along with some free resources there as well on information about used control module programming. So make sure to check out SJ Auto Solutions. I can't recommend that enough.
Hands down amazing.
Well, Jim Linder, who has since passed, was a great guy. And he had one of Jim's skills. He had the ability to surround himself with good people. And so, this is where I met Randy Dillman. And Randy and I are still friends today. This is where I met Michelle, Doug, and that was the core group. It was Jim, Randy, Michelle, and there was other supporting people, but they were kind of the technical support staff. And Jim was probably one of the best hosts you could have. Man, he'd make sure that you had plenty to eat. He was always barbecuing steaks. We had ice cream. He had some kind of direct connection to some company that made chocolate chip cookies. They were never gone. But it was just he created an environment that, and I understand what you're saying, Tommy, about anxiety, but he created an environment where everybody was welcome.
Yep.
There was never a bad thing said, and he provided training. He provided quality training. We started doing it locally to shops in the Indianapolis area. Went up to Fort Wayne with Randy, where Randy lives, and then when he started doing his Linder events, he started to get recognition, and he was kind of one of the first people that really talked about current ramping. Now, I'm not saying he was the first, but he was certainly one of the first that really provided the popularity. And I actually met him in the late '90s at a California, LA training event. I think maybe ASC, Automotive Service Council, something like that. And that's where I first met Jim. And he was doing a class. I came up, I introduced myself to him, and within 30 seconds, he invited me to his guru school free of charge. He paid for everything. He paid for the class,
Awesome.
paid for the hotel. He didn't even know me. I just introduced but that's kind of the person he was. And I think you talk to anybody that interacted with Jim, and sure, different parts of our careers, but that's the kind of story you would hear. Jim would go above and out of his way, but his training was really good. He was one of the first guys where I went to a training event. Everybody took the same class. So kind of like what Jerry Triplia does with TST, there might have been 200, 300, at the peak at a Linder event, but the instructor was on stage. Everybody listened to the same instructor. Jim was never a fan of having to choose between 5 or 6 classes. That was kind of his philosophy. So he did things his own way. He was a big fan of handouts, color handouts, kind of like roll pack, same
Yeah.
thing. But those are things that if you, as you involve yourself in these types of events, you get to see the highs and the lows. For me, it was mostly highs. I saw this is a good way to do a training event. This is a good way to learn how to train. I never hosted an event, but I certainly picked up from watching these other presenters, and I think I've seen most of them, over the years in one form or fashion.
Real regret there, for sure. But I mean, things happen for a reason.
Yeah. Well, and there's a host of instructors today, that are now, doing vision, doing, Seattle, doing Florida, doing the East Coast, that are doing a great job. And that's what we need. Right? We need, like you guys too. I mean, I don't know how much more training you plan on doing. I know it's not easy with a mobile company to be doing it, but it's important that it gets done. That we have people providing good information, because the industry, let's face it, our business is a tough business, and knowledge is a piece of that, and it's sometimes hard to get knowledge. It's hard to get it.
Yeah, and in a digestible format too. That's not always the easiest thing to find. So like you're mentioning, these events that you've trained at and the people that you've had in class and relationships that you made. Is there somebody that you've worked with or taken a class that maybe come back to you at some point or another with like a success story, or like, hey, you helping me out with this or helping me to understand this really made a difference in my career? Do you have any interactions like that stand out in your memory?
I do. I don't like to talk about this, but it's, I don't know. I feel good that I've had these. So I don't get me wrong. I'm always very thankful when I have this conversation. Through a little bit of luck, I've had that conversation frequently. But there's one gentleman, and I don't mind mentioning his name because he always does this to me, and that's Eric Ziegler. I know you both know Eric. Eric is a great guy. I met Eric many years ago down in Peoria. So Eric was working in a repair shop, as a technician. I forget the name of the shop. I think it was actually maybe in Morton, Illinois, but close enough to Peoria. And Eric has told me this many times, and I've actually heard it. I've heard him say this in class when I was in the class, and my face goes multiple shades of red, like in 15 seconds. So, but anyway, I'll just mention Eric because Eric has said to me that when he first went to my class, well, first of all, Tim Hotelling, Automotive Seminars, Tim had gone down to Peoria to sell the class. And he went into Eric's shop. He talked to Eric, and Eric pretty much said that, there's really nothing I need, nothing I can learn. I don't think it's going to benefit me. And I get it. You're a seasoned tech. You reach a certain level, and I'm not sure if Tim gave him a free seat or not. I forget all the details, but Eric ended up going to the class, and Eric told me afterwards that class changed his life. Now, again, these are Eric's words, so I don't mind saying that because he has said that at that time in his career he was thinking about getting out of the business. That he felt that maybe there was another role for him, that it wasn't automotive, it really wasn't the best thing happening for him. But he has told me, and I feel, again, it's very nice. It's very nice of him to say that, but that I helped him somehow in what we discussed that evening, take a different look at the industry and to focus on diagnostics. And obviously, Eric stayed in the industry, became an instructor, created a mobile business down there, and still does a lot of training now. So yes, that he would be one example. That's really all I need to say. I mean, Eric and I only share Eric because he has said it so many times in public. I don't know if he's trying to embarrass me or not, but it's always successful when he says it. He always embarrasses me, but I do, and I joke with him about it. But I do take it to heart. It does mean a lot to me, and there have been others. Again, very fortunate. There have been others that have said something similar. Maybe not at the same scale than what Eric has said to me, but they have been thankful. And I suspect most instructors can probably say that. I think most instructors, if you're around long enough and you care about what you are doing, what the end product is, and it's not just about the delivery. I'm interested in the people that attend the classes. I think that's going to happen because there's probably always people that are thinking, this isn't really this industry's not really for me. I'm not getting the kind of work that I want. I'm not getting the pay that I want. The environment's not the best. Maybe I should look at something else. And sometimes it's the class that can act as the catalyst, or maybe you're in a class at Vision and you sit next to someone and they're talking about all the things they're doing. They got all this equipment, they got all the factory scan tools, they're beta testers, and all of a sudden, if this gentleman can do it or this woman can do it, why can't I do it? So sometimes, it might be the instructor, might be the class, might be the environment that can act as a catalyst to just, push us forward. Because every one of us have had ups and downs in our careers. We have
Yeah, no
days when
doubt.
we can do no wrong. And we have days in which we should have just stayed in bed. We can do no
Hmm.
right. So
Yep,
right, isn't that true?
it's 100% true.
So
I
you
li-
do anything long enough, you know that.
I will touch on something because I think I've kind of made passing mentions of it. And it's one of those things for me, like, because I don't like attention too much either, as dumb as it sounds, because I'm kind of known as a clown and jokester or whatever. But I mean, I think I will agree with Eric that when I was always, in terms for me, a very, like, I really like drivability and diagnostics and electrical diagnostics. I enjoyed them thoroughly. But back when I was in that time frame that I was really at my heaviest, I stopped. I fell off the face of the earth. Like, I didn't want to talk to anybody. I didn't want to go anywhere. I didn't even look up training, and that was like a pretty much between 2010 to 2005. So 5 years went by me with nothing. So when I had my surgery, I lost the weight. I got into programming. I taught myself programming, but I knew that I needed more training, and I really, like, I didn't really, I heard about you in like the early 2000s, but I just never, again, social anxiety. I didn't want to go anywhere. Like, I went to UTI, but it was one of those things where I kind of just sucked it up and went. But I kind of just ended up figuring things out on my own, and that's kind of how I learned. Like, I learned by, respectfully getting my ass kicked on the car, researching it, and then executing it. I don't do well in classrooms. But I joined a couple of Facebook groups when I started kind of getting out of that shell. And in one of those shells, a gentleman, I still know the gentleman today, William Baez. He posted a picture of your class, and I'm like, oh man, I
Yeah.
remember this guy. I'm like, where's this class gonna be? It's gonna be in Allsip. I'm like, is there gonna be, like? So I'm talking to this guy. He's like, no, why don't you just come out this way and blah blah blah. So I ended up going to your class, and I loved it. Like, the training, the environment. I met so many people in the industry going to that class, going to ALSIP. ALSIP, for those who don't know, is on the south side, like South Chicago. I live on the north side, so it was a little bit of a hike for me to get there. But more than likely, because of my location, it was going to be a hike no matter where I was going to go, because you don't really teach inside the city. You go to the north burbs, west burbs, and the south burbs, or in like the west burbs. Either which way, it was going to be 45 minutes to an hour. So I went down there, and uh, the relationships I made, and then I remember the conversation I had with you after class about, like, what do I do to further my training, and you told me I needed to get myself to Vision. And when I got the courage to go, because again, I went to Vision by myself. Like, I didn't know anybody. I didn't know anybody there. My first class, I met a gentleman from Armadillo, Texas, Amarillo, Texas, and he became a good friend of mine. And it just kind of like, when I coming back from Vision, it was a big catalyst for me. I was like, man, this was great. What a rush! Like, I loved my training event. I loved the classes. And we just so happened to have been blessed with Auto Mechanica that year. Auto Mechanica 2017. I missed
Yeah.
2015 for the same reasons, but 2017 was there. And that one meant a lot to me because I wanted to recreate the feeling that I got. A gentleman named Brian Baker, he hosted like this party at Vision at one of the little pubs nearby, and it was a great time. And I'm like, all right, I'm gonna do the same. So I created a chat group. I'm like, all right, anybody wants to be added to this chat group that's coming to Auto Mechanica, let me know. I'm gonna organize and not organize an event because I'm from Chicago, and that was actually what turned out to be like the starting chat group for TBT. So that's basically what came out of there. And like, I probably, and again, I told you when I asked you about the Australia trip, and I thanked you for me being here, and like, no, you put in the work. I'm like, yeah, but it was that catalyst that got me there. And I think that's what comes out of it isn't so much the teaching or the experience, but just knowing that there's high level people that still care about the industry, and you're going to one of their events, and then you just kind of, you spread it, right? And again, like, we repeated the cycle, right? People wanted to come to the CAN conference, so we added more people to the chat group, and it became what it is today. And it wouldn't be there if it wasn't for that. I wouldn't be on this podcast if it wasn't for these classes. So we always inadvertently touch somebody in the industry, and I think that's probably one of the good things about it. And it's not really about attention or people who say like, oh, I don't like the compliments too much, or I get a lot of messages, private messages from people about my classes, and I'm just like, oh no, I mean, like, I appreciate, I don't take them well because I always feel like I can be better. Like, there's things I could have done better, and I push myself to be a better
Mhm.
instructor. But there are definitely a lot of success stories that are going to be tied into to you. And I don't consider myself like successful, but I feel like I wouldn't be where I'm at if it wasn't for your classes and the amount of time that I got here. So I
Well,
have to thank you as well.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I don't know if I initially thought that you liked me or not, Tommy, because the first time I ever went to your shop, do you know you remember where you put me to work?
Yeah, in the
Let me
back.
give you a hint. In the alley.
It wasn't the alley, man. It was close to the
It
alley.
was It was well, my truck was in the alley. I was in now this a Chicago alley is a unique alley, so you have to be very careful on the north side in the Chicago
But we
alley. But
we made sure you were safe, though. I promise.
oh, I wasn't. I'm just kidding you. But I think I still remember when we were working on. I think we were working on a Chrysler minivan 3833, and we're looking at cam crank sync.
That one actually was a Dodge Ram. Sorry, Dodge Dakota. A
Was it the Dakota?
4.7 liter. It was a Dakota 4.7 liter, and that one actually, my guy installed the crank wrong, if you remember
Well,
correct.
yeah, I remember something
Yeah.
got
No, sorry, the
installed
cam, the
incorrectly.
cam, the cam gear got was
Yeah.
clocked, and yeah, that was our first. I mean, I went to your classes, but I would
No,
call
no,
on you when I yeah, when I
no.
had issues, and yeah, no, I did get better after that. Hey, I'm
Well,
just a
I
Bronco
will
man.
say, yeah, I was well. That was the only time I was in the alley. The rest of the times I actually came in through the front. So I think so. Things got way better after that. So I didn't know if you would remember that first visit or not.
I
It's
don't know.
kind
I
of humorous.
remember, and and you know what? When I remember that, when I went mobile, and some of these guys they wanted me to work on this, and I was just like, man, you can go fly a kite home, skillet. You called me, bro. And I would think of John. I'm like, man, I was such an asshole. I made him work in the band, like he's brown too.
Oh yeah,
Oh
I
man,
mean
good times.
Yeah, I think you get a group of mobile techs together, and you'll get a pretty good sense of sometimes how we're doing things. It's not always inside of a warm shop,
Yeah.
with a table and plenty of electrical and good lighting, and it can be the opposite sometimes. But
Questionable situations. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, and that's okay. It's what we signed up for. You take the
Mhm.
Yeah.
you take the interesting with the not so interesting. That's just how it goes. But getting back to what you said, that's and again for less experienced technicians or technicians starting out, it is important to get involved with the industry. And every one of us goes to an event for the first time. So, Vision is a big event. It is a little overwhelming the first time you go there. There's hundreds and hundreds of people. The Worldpac event is also, very, very large. But, many times there are local events that are put on that's how you start. You just go to a local event. Now, depending where your shop is, you may have to drive or maybe hop on a plane. I'm not sure, but it would be worth doing that. And then, eventually you get to these bigger events, and this is how we get to meet each other. This is how we get to know each other, you never know where these relationships are going to go. It might end up being might be a job offer. Somebody may say, you know what, I'd love to have you come on board. Or you're sitting next to a shop owner. He's got 10 or 12 locations. He's always looking for someone. You just never know at these events. So it's definitely worth it, not just for the education, but for the benefit of getting to know, our fellow industry workers.
Yeah. 100%. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm still friends with some of these guys. Pedro, I met Pedro at your training event at your classes. Tim Jones,
Mm-hmm.
gentleman, Will, a few of them. Yeah, I'm still keeping contact.
Oh yeah, it's again, the longer we do this, the longer that list of relationships becomes, right? Just there's a lot of people that they may not be quote unquote famous, in terms of having a podcast or having a YouTube channel, but quality people, very very knowledgeable people.
Yeah, you never know the impact that somebody's going to make on you or your career when you meet them, or vice versa too. Like you might be that person for somebody else, but yeah, getting out there and actually making those connections, and then years later, yeah, maybe you're best friends or employer, something like that. You have no idea how that's gonna play out down the road, but you got to start it somewhere, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And something
100%.
else that anybody can really do. That it's a smaller version of that is get together with two or three or four guys on a weekend to look at a
Yeah.
vehicle. Whether it's a research, maybe we don't know much about, a variable valveless system on a Pentastar yet. So maybe we find the vehicle and we just kind of go through it, or we have a couple of broke vehicles. And, I continue to do that. Scott Manna and I did that literally for years. Usually, well, at his shop primarily, sometimes the school, sometimes we'd go to one of my customer shops, but mostly at his shop. And we would either have a vehicle that we were trying to diagnose, or we had vehicles that we were researching. Either I would get them or we'd rent them. I mean, I'm in Chicago. You can rent anything you want.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure I can even get a Maserati.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But rentals are never a problem. But and you mentioned Pedro and Tim and Petey. They're getting together the end of the month to do a little bit of research.
Yeah.
So
And Pedro
you
asked me
just
to ask you if you're coming.
yeah, I have it down on my calendar. I have it down on my calendar.
All right. Yeah, because I
So
need to know from. I'm bringing the food.
I'm not sure I know how to take that, but anyway, yeah, I'm coming. But but it doesn't have to be anything elaborate. It could just be a couple guys that work together, or I know a couple guys who work at other shops, and you just get together for to do something. You carve out a little bit of time on a Saturday or a Sunday, and yeah, it's a sacrifice because everybody's got a personal life, but you do it, and maybe it's just a better use the scan tool, or better use the scope, or better use the
Hmm.
multimeter for heck, the topic, it's not really important. And that also, generates relationships. You heard me say a little while ago that we used to have where I don't know who came up with the name, but we call them Pico days. And we would do it at Scott's shop. It was a weekend. Matt Fonslow would come down. Scott Brown flew in one time from the Los Angeles area. Uh, Craig from Pico, when he was down in Texas, he flew in. So and there's a lot of guys. Pete Landry, Bob Hype, names you would know, Ken Zanders. But guys
Shanahan.
came, Matt Shanahan, guys came in, and we had projectors, we had tables, obviously, we had food and such, but we would it was a good social get together. We had a lot of fun, but we were doing stuff, we were learning things, and some of it was broke cars, some of it was rental cars, but that's another way to further your education without necessarily going to a Vision or a World Pack event, or ASTE, whatever that there's going on. And fortunately now, 2025, events have come back, so there's more and more events to choose from. That's something that can be done easily, and it can be very beneficial.
Yeah, and low cost too.
100%.
If it's just you and a few buddies getting together at a shop, I mean, just the time, obviously you're donating towards it, but yeah, you can learn more than you think just hanging out with some other professionals. It's definitely a cool thing.
Absolutely.
So much fun, especially if there's a broken car. Those are the fun ones for me, because we did that at my shop once. It was me, Pedro, Tim, Kurt Bourne drove all the way from where he's at, and
Peoria,
and
yeah.
Petey. Yeah, is it Peoria? I thought he was like somewhere like between there and like
Well,
Normal or something.
yeah, he may not exactly be in Peoria, but that's where I met him,
Or
so
he's
I
close.
associate him with Peoria.
Gotcha. So he
Right
comes
or
up.
wrong.
That guy's dedicated, man. Like, he'll drive 3 hours to come hang out, or to even go to your classes, for example. And
He's very dedicated.
yeah, so we tag him along. He's an awesome guy, and yeah, I bought everybody some food. We had a great time, and we ended up fixing the car, which meant the world to me, because that car had me. I thought I was about to light it on fire. It took two Picos to figure out what was going on with it. Awesome time.
Well, we're about to crack 2 hours here. I want to be respectful of your time. Was there anything else that you wanted to touch on before we wrap it up?
You know what? I'll
Can't
just
believe we.
mention, in your list of questions that Tommy sent, the last question was, if you could give one piece of advice to technicians trying to improve their diagnostic skills, what would it be? And that's that's a very broad question. There's a lot you could talk about. We could have another 2 hours probably on that. But I
Yeah.
think probably the one singular piece that might give the greatest bang for the buck is that of documentation, of documenting, and it could be on a pad, an 8.5 by 11 pad, it could be in a notebook, just documenting the process that you used on a particular vehicle. Just kind of take your thoughts and put them into words, because that forces you to think, and by doing that, you've started to create a guideline, a process, or an approach. And at the beginning, it's not going to be anything impressive. But if you continue to do that as you deal with difficult vehicles, I think that will really help in how we approach and diagnose vehicles. There's something to be said for doing something for a long time, but you have to do the right things for a long time to get good results. And I think one of the right things is documenting, whether it be paper, Word, PowerPoint, just thinking about what you did, how you did it. It doesn't have to be super detailed. It doesn't have to be 1,000 words, just some key bullets, kind of maybe chronological. And then you say, that was effective, that wasn't effective. That cranking current test, I did it. I wasn't particularly good at it. I didn't figure out how to sync, but I hooked up the high end current probe correctly. I need to work on that. So it can also be a guideline for training or areas that I have to improve upon. And it could be just training on YouTube. It doesn't necessarily have to be a class, but I can go to a YouTube channel, maybe Ivan's channel or Eric's channel, and say, I watched these guys do this. So now I can play it back 10 times if I have to see how it's done. So I think if we want to wrap up that, I think to help a less experienced tech move forward efficiently, I think documentation is really important and sometimes underlooked. We should just don't even consider it. But I think it's an important piece. It has been for me. It has worked. It has worked well for me.
Yep. Game changer here too. And I did have to force myself at the beginning to get into the routine of doing it on a regular basis. But like once I got that rolling and I started to see the benefits from it, and now it's like, I wouldn't continue doing this without a documentation process.
Yeah,
no way.
Good. Yeah, it's important. Well, it was a pleasure having this
Yeah.
conversation. When you said 2 hours, I guess it is 2 hours. So
Yeah,
Yeah,
this was a blast, man.
thank you so much for spending the time. I genuinely appreciate it, and yeah, it's been wanting to do it for a long time, so it's awesome.
great. Well, thank you very much, Tommy, Sean, and of course, thank you to your listeners. Continue with the good work, gentlemen. You guys, I'll
Thank
be
you, sir.
listening. So continue. Thank you.
Yes,
I hope
sir.
so.
All right.
And I'm sorry in
Okay.
advance.
All right, that's going to do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for John for joining me. Thank you to Tommy for getting this set up. And thank you to everyone else out there for listening to the show. Always appreciate that. Wouldn't have the show without you. And hopefully you enjoyed that episode. But that's all I got for you today. Let's all get out there, start fixing the world one car at a time.